You're listening to School Counseling Simplified, a podcast with easy-to-implement strategies for busy school counselors. Here's your host, Rachel Davis from Bright Futures Counseling.
You're listening to another episode of School Counseling Simplified. In today's episode, I interview Brandon, and he talks all about embracing neurodiversity. Brandon was one of our Summer Summit presenters, and he really dug deep on this topic last month during the conference. But in today's episode, we talk about what it means to be neurodivergent and how school counselors can implement inclusive practices for all brains. I really love this episode because Brandon makes it go from intimidating to totally doable and simple. So if you feel like you don't really know anything about this, or you're not sure how to help students whose brains may be a little different than yours, who have autism or who have other learning differences, then you will find this episode especially helpful. It's definitely a must listen as we go into back to school season, so you can get some ideas of how to set up your office to support all learners. Okay guys, let's dive into today's episode with Brandon. Let's play a little game of Would You Rather, School Counselor Edition. Okay, would you rather spend your weekend planning a group or spend your afternoon sitting in irrelevant PD? Yikes. Or would you rather be the only counselor with no one to collaborate with, or to spend hours searching online for engaging activities? All of these options are pretty bad, right? But unfortunately, they're all too real. But what if I told you I had a solution for you? What if I told you I had access to hundreds of school counseling lessons, groups, and activities, counselor-specific trainings on the topics you need most, and a community of like-minded school counselors to support you? You would say, yes, please. Well, that is what Impact is all about. Impact is my monthly membership for school counselors, and it helps you with all of these things. You get access to hundreds of resources. That's unlimited free downloads. Log in and get what you need right away to every single resource that's in my store. We add new resources each and every month. We're adding a new middle school and elementary resource each month, and some of these are bonus Impact exclusives, meaning that you can get resources just for members. You can request resources that you need and easily search so you can find exactly what you're looking for. And let's talk about the trainings, counselor-specific trainings on the topics you need most. We do these each and every month as part of our Coffee with the Counselor series. Impact members get to join for absolutely free. You earn PD certificates, and you get exclusive access to members-only things like the Ultimate Small Group Experience and our Summer Summit Conference. And the community. Y'all, this is possibly my favorite part of Impact. I so look forward to jumping on these calls, to getting to know counselors who are similar to me and also completely different. It's so fun to hear from your experiences and your challenges, and everyone brings a unique perspective to the table. We have an exclusive online community, and we even have a cool app where you can chat with other counselors in these community circles. We have our monthly calls, like I mentioned, twice a month, and we share wins, troubleshoot tough cases, and just talk about what it's like to be a counselor, because so often we're on our own island at our school sites. So if any of that sounds like it's for you, I would love to see you inside Impact. Go to stressfreeschoolcounseling.com/impact to solve all of your counselor problems. And I have a special offer for my listeners. Use code POD at checkout to save 10% off your first month. Okay, let's go to today's episode. Hi, Brandon. How are you?
Hello. Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm doing well.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I can't wait to get to know you better. So this episode will air after our Summer Summit, but you were one of our Summer Summit presenters. So thank you again for doing that. We just are so excited to learn from you.
I'm so grateful to be part of this experience and get to share out this information. And thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, of course. So let's start by telling us a little bit about who you are and your background in education so far.
Yeah, so I am a parent. I am a biracial, bisexual school counselor that's also an advocate for neuro-affirming practices and LGBTQI plus inclusion. This is my sixth year that I'm heading into as a school counselor, my fourth in elementary school. I work in Santa Ana, California, which is it's a very segregated community that's about 98% Latinx. But I love the community. I love the school that I work for, and love the elementary school counseling we get to do.
Yeah, elementary is the best. I agree. So let's dive in a little more. I want to talk to you about neurodiversity because that's what your Summer Summit presentation was on, and that's kind of like your niche, right? So can you share, let's just pretend that our listeners, because some of them may be like brand new to this concept of neurodiversion, maybe they don't know what this means. Can we kind of get like a very entry level definition?
Yeah. So when we're looking at neurodiversity, that's really kind of like, that's just saying that every brain is different, right? So that's everybody, me, you, those who are listening, all of our students, everybody's brain functions and behaves slightly different. And so that's what makes up neurodiversity. And so when we talk about neurodiversity, we want to be inclusive in understanding that each person's brain develops differently. And then when I talk about neurodivergence, specifically, these are brains that just function differently than what's considered the norm. Now, again, because what neurodiversity says is that everybody's brain functions differently. Technically, there's no such thing as normal, but neurodivergence is more of how society kind of structures and views how certain brains function compared to others. And so neurodivergence is really something that I've been looking into and trying to understand. How can I support brains that aren't typically being taught to, like they're taught with that inclusion in mind? And because the reality is a lot of the ways that we teach students or counsel students may not necessarily be applicable for everybody in the room. And so what are some ways that we can change our practices to be a little bit more inclusive and understanding of all of the students' needs, whether they're diagnosed or not?
Right.
Um, and I say that because the reality is a lot of our students don't have a diagnosis. Maybe not yet. Maybe maybe somebody hasn't gotten them assessed or hasn't really seemed to impact their academics in the ways that stand out more than other students. And so the reality is, we don't necessarily always know who's neurodivergent and who's not neurodivergent. And so, how do we take that information and try to change our practices to be more encompassing of everybody in the room's needs?
Yes, I love that. And I want to dive deep on some strategies counselors can use. But before, I'm just curious, how did you get into this work? What kind of sparked the interest in learning more about neurodivergence?
You There was a few things kind of happening at the same time. So I've got three children and young children, and the youngest, Andre, he we noticed from a very young age that he was developing slower than what the expected age milestones were for movement, for speech, for a lot of different things like that. And so in the process of taking him and trying to, get evaluated and trying to figure out, the why behind the delays he was experiencing. I was just educating myself about all types of things, and a lot of signs were always pointing towards autism. And now, as of today, he does not have an autism diagnosis, but that kind of information gathering was really kind of opening up my eyes. And then through that, it was looking at the students I'm working with. I work with a lot of autistic students. We have some schools have different models, but the school I work at, we have a lot of self-contained classes, and so I was kind of struggling, and how do I reach some of these students? And the combination of those two things, plus an amazing PD from one of our SLPs, our speech language pathologists at our site, she gave a professional development to our staff about neurodivergence and inclusive practices, and just kind of understanding how to support different students' needs. And it was like those three things kind of converged all around the same time. And it just led me to think, like, how can school counselors do more to support? And I was Googling, I was searching, I was trying to find the answers. ASCA, didn't really provide a whole lot of information. Some of their information was a little outdated, and then just finding the research and things like that just doesn't quite exist. There's not a lot of literature yet. And so I spent last summer just reading and trying to understand. And I spent the school year trying out these different practices and, failing and trying and failing and just trying to find different ways that can better support our students. And so it's really just all of these kind of pieces came together at the same time. And yeah, if you would have asked me like a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I wouldn't be able to say like this is the path I would be on because this wasn't something I was really thinking about before.
Right. Well, it sounds like it was kind of meant to be. All these pieces fell into place. I love to hear that you had like an insight PD that was helpful. That's so encouraging because so often, those PDs feel kind of like a waste of time. So I love to hear that your SLP was bringing and that it was coming from the SLP. That's so great. I'm always encouraging counselors to like present it, their own schools and everything. So I love that piece. Well, let's dive in. I'm sure everyone's like, yes, I need this. I want this. So let's dive into some of those strategies because I know we have some listeners who are, they may be intimidated doing a class lesson in general, So let's talk about how they can be inclusive to all brains.
Yeah, I think intimidated is such a good word to use because I feel that. I think school counselors naturally we are so caring and compassionate and want to make a difference. And so when I see things not happening, I don't think it's because of like a lack of desire to want to. It's just more of that unsure of doing it right. And so so I really do encourage, those to try and just try. And as I've mentioned, try and it's okay to fail as you learn. That's part of the learning is the growth. But I definitely have some tips, that we can get started with. One of the big ones that I try to harp on is to presume competence. That's the first thing because a lot of times our students, receiving specialized education, I think that they are presumed that they are unable to do something. And there's a lack of awareness. And maybe if a student, for example, doesn't speak much, it might feel like they don't understand, but the reality is they probably do really understand. They just don't communicate verbally for whatever reason. And so one of those big inclusive practices that's it's a place to start is you want to presume competence that every student can succeed. Everybody can understand, and they all have their own unique strengths and capabilities. There's a lot of stereotypes out there, and we really want to try to avoid those. For example, we might hear like, this is a student who has ADHD. They're going to be very, very hyper, bouncing around. And the reality is sometimes, yeah, that's the case. But there's also, that's not what ADHD looks like for everybody. And but we want to assume that they can succeed with the right supports in place. A big area to focus in on is making things sensory friendly. And so sensory, we're thinking about, all the different senses, our sound, our sight, our touch, our smells. So we're looking at how do our spaces look, and how can we accommodate students when they need those extra supports. And so a big thing is start with your classroom, start with your space. This is the number one place. We can't control all the environments that our students go to, but we can build some kind of a control within the room that we have. So for me, a big one is like most classrooms, I noticed, I have those overhead lights that are very bright. And for a lot of students, that could be very triggering to their sensory. It could be sensory overload, just with those bright lights. And so in my room, I have all the lights off. I have lamps put up throughout the room and some natural sunlight that we're able to get. And also some LED lights that students can kind of play with as well. So we have a lot of different light options. And the reality is not everyone's going to need the same thing. Not everyone's going to want the same thing, but it's about having that flexibility, having those options to build that sensory space because something like lighting could be very stimulating for students. Um, Other things are the sounds, right? So sometimes sounds can be very overwhelming, and we can't control a lot of these things. For example, my room is right where the playground is, so there it feels like all day I've got kids outside playing and screaming and running around, and so I can't necessarily prevent my room from being loud. But what I can do is offer things like headphones to kind of put on and make people feel a little bit more cozy. I can play some calming music in the room. And again, every student's going to be different. So understanding that what one student wants might be different than the other. So it's okay to ask, like, does this make you feel better? Does this make you feel worse? What is it that you want? And you just kind of adjust as needed. Um,
I
and
have a quick
then,
question about
oh yeah,
that.
of course. Uh-huh.
Look, we're in a one-on-one setting for sure. Like, let's, accommodate the setting environment to meet that child's needs. But in a class setting, do you kind of default to the dimmer lights and the less sound as as a baseline, assuming that most students, even if they're neurotypical, will find it calming?
Thank you. Exactly. I will default to that because I think I found most people can find that very calming, right? And back to again, we don't know who's neurodivergent and who's not. And so sometimes just dimming the lights for everybody creates a sense of calm that the whole room can like and appreciate. Again, sometimes it's difficult when I'm pushing into a classroom, right? I don't always have control over that teacher's setup. So they might not have lamps around. Um, but it's something to consider. So if it's something you can do, maybe you have a portable kind of lamp or something, or some kind of light structure that you can have with you. I don't. And so, it's one of those things I've been working with teachers on. How do they develop their classrooms and how do they make it more sensory friendly? Because it shouldn't just be to the counseling office. Um, so that's a big place, is that's where you want to go. Is now you start talking about that with the teachers and try to build in that buy-in so that they create a more sensory friendly classroom, because the reality is the student's going to spend most of their day with them, and so we want them to stay regulated as long as possible. And so having that dimmed lighting and reduced sounds is so important. um so, and a lot of these practices hard. They're not easy. It's not, and it's hard to make a list of like these are the checklist of things to do, because every student's going to vary, and everybody's like classroom management is going to vary, and so it takes a lot of work. It's not like a magic fix to say, okay, we are now going to meet everybody's needs perfectly. But the reality is we're just going to keep trying and keep making those tweaks as needed.
Mhm.
Um, and as school counselors, something we do often is we will have assemblies at my site, and so we will have large group kind of activities. And so again, thinking about the sounds of those, we notice a lot of students they get overwhelmed by the loud cheers and chants and whatnot that happens with these large groups. And so just communicating with the teachers ahead of time and saying, hey, we're going to be doing this. At certain moments of this assembly, it may be getting loud. um, Talk to your students and let them know if they need to step away, they can. If they need to have something to cover their ears, they can. We try to provide those. Every budget looks different, though. A lot of the resources that we have on my site have come out of just our own funding and trying to raise funds. So some people are going to have access to more supports than others. But it just comes back to the communication and just trying to work with the teachers and the other staff members to kind of build that same buy-in.
Yeah, definitely. I'm kind of putting you on the spot because I
Yeah.
didn't say in advance, but do you have like a story or like a case study of like a student that you've worked with who you've seen like a positive impact as a result of making some of these changes?
Yeah, let me pull into my mind right now. But so for a lot of our students, yeah, they come into, especially like they come into our room to regulate, right? And they always comment on just like how calming our space is, how relaxing our space is. And so that's one way, because then we invite teachers in to our room, and then they see that. They
Mhm.
see what we've done with the space. And I say we because I share a space with two other school counselors. And but they see what we're doing, and they see our approach. And so we've had teachers make changes, to their classrooms and see like differences that are made, especially with some of the students that tend to get very dysregulated. And so specifically, we had this one student who was really, really struggling. Just every day, the teacher would send the student to our room because they were crying. The student is autistic, and but was in a general ed class, and really just didn't always understand why they were feeling upset, and they would just be crying and crying. And um but they would come into our room, feel calm down, and then we'd send them back to class. And it wasn't so much of a specific intervention that we were doing. It was just the student needed to calm. And so we went into the classroom, we looked at what was going on, and there was just some tweaks that we could make into the classroom because the classroom was a little bit overstimulating. Things like the lighting, the sounds, and the sounds sometimes it's just coming from the students. So it's about managing the the classroom and how we what is acceptable and what's unacceptable, as far as like the shouting and how we kind of communicate with one another. So we've kind of worked with the teacher a little bit on that type of classroom management. Um, we built a calm corner within the classroom, and so that student can go there to relax when needed. But some other tweaks like that. And so by the time, after months of the student coming in almost every day, multiple times a day, in tears, the student stopped coming by. I mean, I miss the student, but I'm so happy to see that, that progress has been made just by making some adjustments within the classroom.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think sometimes for the listeners, it's fun. They can get like a, tangible idea of what that would look like, whether maybe a student they have who's similar. Yeah, I love that. Like you said, you didn't even do a certain type of intervention, just by noticing the environment shift. That was the intervention, right? And then you could carry that to their classroom. So yeah, thank you. That's awesome.
One of the other, one of the other things that we do it's an intervention, but not a huge intervention. It's because a lot of neurodivergent learners, they really struggle with executive functioning, and especially transitions. And so we notice a lot of dysregulation happens, especially we're looking at our younger students. It really, really, they get very dysregulated when it comes to transitioning from one activity to the next, especially if that activity that they're leaving is a preferred activity.
Mhm.
And so what we've done is we like to pass out timers. Sometimes teachers will use their own timers, but I just buy a big box of timers, visual timers that the students can control, and it makes such a difference. It's like it's a very little thing that we have to do, but we show them how to use the timer. We talk about it with the teacher ahead of time. So then the teacher will say, okay, set your timer. We're gonna do 10 more minutes of this activity. They put the timer for 10 minutes, and then when that timer goes off, they know that it's time to go because they've been looking at that timer too. So they know exactly how much time they have left. I can't say it's like 100% foolproof, but it's made such a huge difference. Just that simple thing of allowing somebody to have control or at least a visual aid to support them in that transition. So it's a very simple task to buy some timers, and so I highly recommend it. Also, just talking to the teachers, they can use like visual timers and things like that.
Yeah, that's such a good idea. That's great. I'm glad to hear that these are simple, right? So that counselors can feel more empowered to try them and less intimidated. As we wrap up, what's something you would like to share for counselors who are going into the upcoming school year? What's some advice for them?
Yeah, it's okay to try and not be perfect. I think sometimes a lot of us are perfectionists and we want to do things that we know we're going to be really good at. And it's okay if you're not good at it yet, but try something. Just try something. Get to know some of your special education students and just try things out. Maybe build a club for students that want to join or start just making some minor adjustments to your space and your practices and just thinking about the learners that you have. And so it's not going to be perfect right away, but the more you are building your practice and building your plans with others, like other brain functions in mind, the better it's going to be. And so you'll see a lot of these changes with some minor tweaks, but a lot of it's going to come within of just saying something needs to be done to understand that not everybody is learning the same way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. That's such sound advice and encouraging words as we go into back to school. Where can the listeners find you if they want to connect, Brandon?
Yes, if you are on Instagram, I am at Big School Counselor. So please follow me there. I think that's the best way to connect. And if you have any questions, please reach out, send a message, and I'll try to get back to you with something.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. It was great chatting with you today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to School Counseling Simplified. You can find the links from today's episode in the show notes. If you'd like to connect with Rachel, she's on Instagram and Teachers Pay Teachers at Bright Futures Counseling. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any episodes of School Counseling Simplified. Talk to you next week.